is going to be under so much pressure going into this fourth year. Because when you think about LSU, Nick Saban, Ed Orgeron, and Les Miles all won a national title in their fourth season at LSU. And when you hand somebody 10 years, $95 million, that's the expectation to win a national title. And even when you go back and you listen to Brian Kelly's initial press conference in terms of why he took the job, it was, hey, LSU has the resources to win. Hey, they have the history, they have the pedigree. And he compared it to the American League East of baseball, where you have the New York Yankees and the Red Sox and whatnot too. But when you look at LSU, the one thing that kind of sticks to mind is hey, you go back towards the beginning of the year where they went on that 6-game winning streak. Obviously, who can't forget the Saturday night game versus Ole Miss that ultimately went into overtime and that they won. Took care of business versus Arkansas, South Carolina, UCLA, all those teams. And then as soon as that Texas A&M game that they had, where Marcel Reed essentially ran all over that LSU defense, I think that's where really the skid happened, because after that they lost 42-13 to Alabama, and then obviously the 27-16 loss versus Florida when they were at Ben Griffin Stadium too. And when you think about LSU, and obviously Brian Kelly is a phenomenal coach, and I think one of the things that you have to admire about him, he understands the X's and O's. He's done it everywhere. He's had success at Cincinnati. He had success at Notre Dame, and this just felt like the next best spot for him. And when you kind of sit there and you reflect on what's going on, I mean, right now they are 8th in the country in terms of composite recruiting class, according to 24/7 Sports. So they are right on track in terms of where they need to be. And then when you look at in terms of what they need moving forward, a couple things come to mind. Obviously, I think the offensive line is something that's going to have to be tweaked significantly. Garrett Nuissmeier is coming back for a senior year, which is a really huge positive. You have Michael Van Buren, who's looking to back up Garrett Nuissmeier and possibly be the guy afterwards. And that's a really great insurance policy, by the way. The kid from Mississippi State, he's got a phenomenal arm. He's freakishly athletic, solid enough mechanics to be able to work with, and quite frankly, just a really good insurance policy for this LSU team, for a team that quite frankly that needs it too. I mean, you sit there and say to yourself, man, if Nuissmeier could have got a little bit better protection and maybe a couple more catches here and there, it definitely kind of makes you wonder what LSU could be too. But also, you kind of find that catch-22, because Brian Kelly has taken a lot of risks to really get to where he's at, quite frankly. And I say that in the sense of, I go back and think about the move going from Mike Dunbrick to Joe Sloan as their offensive coordinator. Obviously, this game is always kind of being younger in the sense everybody's kind of looking for the Sean McVay, or everybody's looking for the Cliff Kingsbury, or you get what I mean when in terms of that sort of equivalent. And when Mike Dunbrick ultimately went to Notre Dame to be offensive coordinator under Marcus Freeman, it definitely scratched a lot of heads in the sense of LSU essentially, and Brian Kelly and that staff was essentially saying, hey, we're going to take the gamble because we really believe in Joe Sloan and everything. But you got to say to yourself, if you really look at the stats, I would argue there's some question marks there. I mean, let's look at the stats here. I mean, average yards in terms of yards per play, 6.11, which is 9th in the SEC. And then you look at points per game, 28.6 points, which is 11th in the SEC. And, I'm not going to sit here and talk crap about Nuissmeier, because I think he's a solid enough quarterback. He's a guy that you can certainly win games with. Does LSU have enough receivers to make some noise in the SEC? Absolutely. But I think what really hurt LSU kind of going in that 3-game stretch that they ultimately lost in, and kind of just some of the weaknesses that you saw going into the beginning of the season, one of the big questions was the defensive line. And the big question was obviously that they didn't address the defensive line, particularly in the transfer portal. And I got to say, they were definitely a lot better than I anticipated, especially given a lot of those guys were a little bit on the younger side, and they had to take a little bit more reps than they usually would, because simply the depth that they typically have in the defensive line simply wasn't there. But if you really look at it, they definitely had a solid year, and you have to give them some credit for that too. I mean, granted, when you look back at some of these games that they got whooped in, a lot of it does come down to not being able to run the ball as much. And obviously when those teams are obviously able to have success being able to run the ball, that opens up for the play action, some of those explosive plays like we saw in the Texas A&M game, for example, or Jalen Milroe, where he can sit there and be able to run a zone read option and then turn around and throw a 50-yard strike down the field. And that's just a bad recipe for LSU football when you're putting that all together. But everybody knows, obviously, the expectation is to win a national title. And obviously, they're saying to themselves, hey, we weren't really expecting to play in the Texas Bowl versus Baylor, which, by the way, shout out to Baylor. They had a phenomenal season this year, especially with Dave Arnada essentially being on the hot seat. So shout out to them. But when you sit there and say to yourself, hey, they've essentially went all in on Brian Kelly. They've let him do whatever he wants to his staff. You're 8th in the country in terms of recruiting. And they just brought in the kid from Northwestern in the transfer portal. So they're slowly but surely kind of tweaking their way into getting an elite recruiting class too. And Brian Kelly, as much as I have been critical of him on the show, and as much as I sometimes love to hear him be cynical and bitch and whine on the sidelines, he does have some valid points sometimes. I mean, obviously, I think the little tirade that he went on against the Florida game, quite frankly, is something that you should be doing in the locker room, not something that you should be doing on national television with millions of cameras there. But at the same time, you sit there and say to yourself, okay, you gave this guy $95 million. He's donated $1 million of his own money into the NIL collective. So it's hard to sit there and complain about every little thing. But at the same time, when you sit there and say to yourself, okay, technically, even though they're 8th, your recruiting class is already behind Texas, Georgia, and Alabama. And more than likely, they'll be behind Ole Miss too at this rate, particularly within that recruiting class too. Because I mean, you look into 2025 and moving forward, they're 6th right now, and everything's kind of coming together to some extent too. Because obviously, he's pushed back on transfer portal a lot too. Because we do live in a reality to some extent where players do want to be bought. They don't necessarily want to have to sit there and be, and be developed to some degree. Because even if you look at the quote at the very bottom of the ticker, that's exactly what I mentioned in a couple seconds ago about how initially their target was initially the defensive line, and ultimately they weren't able to get enough money in order to get these guys. So they try to engage, they try to build relationships, they try to, develop the guys that they get. But at the end of the day, if the price tag isn't there, then it's kind of for broke. And when you hear Duke committing $4 million to Menza, the quarterback from Tulane, and you hear about some of these other figures, it definitely makes you wonder, can LSU really get over that hump of being a player in the SEC? Because I mean, you sit there and say to yourself, hey, they are not used to being, stuck behind the Georgias and the Alabamas. They should be competing with them. And when you sit there and say to yourself, hey, an 8-4 seasons are simply not good enough in Baton Rouge. And, I'll cut him some slack on the USC loss simply because that was beginning of the year and USC showed a lot of strides in terms of the defensive front. And I just did an episode on them a couple days ago. Definitely go and check that out. But the reality is that LSU won the games that they were supposed to win aside from Florida, right? I mean, they beat South Carolina. They whooped South Alabama. They beat Vanderbilt and they beat Oklahoma, right? Those are all good things to have. But, going into 2025, when you look at the schedule and you kind of say to yourself, what are sort of the aches that you can see? I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is the August 30th matchup versus Clemson, which I love that Clemson is scheduling some SEC opponents. Obviously, they played Georgia last year and got whooped. But to start week 0 versus at Clemson too, by the way, I think that's going to be one of those games for Brian Kelly that's really going to be on my radar in terms of, can they really get over the hump and be able to win that national championship too? Because a lot of the criticisms that Brian Kelly has got, for example, is having Joe Sloan instead of Dunbrick. There's also been a valid amount of criticisms of, has Brian Kelly changed or evolved enough to the point where his message is speaking to the kids in Louisiana? Because obviously recruiting at LSU is not the same as Notre Dame. Obviously at Notre Dame, you're selling the prestige, you're selling the history, you're selling the sort of, Midwest hard homegrown sort of message, whereas LSU, it's just simply not the same thing. You are more of a rural kind of area, but at the same time, it is a college town, and they've had years and years of recent college football success. So it's not quite exactly the same message. And even if you read the article with Bruce Feldman over at The Athletic too, that's one of the things that those insiders sort of questioned, is whether or not his message is resonating or not, and whether or not Brian Kelly can develop in the same way. Because I mean, right now he's in his 60s right now, and I do think he is a good coach, and I think he probably was the best guy out there at the time. I mean, it's easy to sit there and say, oh, this didn't work for this or this didn't work for that. But at the same time, we are in the age of college football where you just simply have to pay 80, 90, $100 million if you want these top tier coaches. And it worked out for everybody, right? Because Notre Dame is doing their thing with Marcus Freeman. Brian Kelly took the better opportunity and ultimately had more resources. But when push comes to shove, it's just simply time for LSU to step up and win a national title. But when you look at their schedule and you say, hey, they play the typical SEC suspects, but they're going to have Ole Miss again at Ole Miss this time on the 27th. Then you're going to have a really tough South Carolina team October 11th. And then obviously they're going to have to take care of business November 8th at Bryant-Denny Stadium versus Alabama. So definitely look for those games on that schedule. But in terms of LSU in general, I think there's a lot to be optimistic about in terms of looking at the recruiting class. They're making some noise in terms of really tweaking this offensive line. And for the most part, too, they're going to have to address the safeties, because if they keep getting torched on some of these bigger explosive plays and Garrett Nuissmeier doesn't get as much help, particularly running the ball as much as he should be, they could be facing the same exact problem that they were this year.